Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the All Might Be Edified discussions on servant leadership. I'm Keith Pankow, the host of this podcast. I'm so excited to be here with Commander Stephen Bor, a good friend of mine, and he's also an operational leader, a legal advisor, a father, and husband that serves in the Coast Guard and has done so for more than 20 years. He currently serves as the Deputy Chief of the Coast Guard Office of Information and Intelligence Law. He served in various operational leadership positions at the Coast Guard units in Los Angeles, Long Beach, Corpus Christi, and San Francisco. In his capacity as a Coast Guard JAG, he served as a Special Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington and as a Senior Staff Attorney for the Coast Guard's 13th District in Seattle, Washington. Commander Bor received the 2021 Coast Guard Captain David H. Jarvis Inspirational Leadership Award and the 2016 DHS Office of General Counsel Rising Star Award. Stephen is also a huge Seattle Sounders fan, and he speaks fluent Mandarin and Spanish. Well, welcome, Stephen. So excited to have you on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Keith.
I like to tell people that I'm not fluent in any languages, so you've got a couple up on me, although people know I speak a couple languages as well. So I find that fun to toy with people a little bit. Well, Captain Jarvis, this is a great award. So the longest rescue mission ever undertaken in Coast Guard history was led by Captain David Henry Jarvis. He received a gold medal of honor at the request of President William McKinley in recognition of this effort, known as the Overland Relief Expedition. This award recognizes Coast Guard active duty member and is presented in partnership with the Navy League. So it's a really inspiring award that Stephen was recognized with when he was at Sector LA Long Beach. So Stephen, tell us about this. What did this award mean to you and what did you receive it for?
Well, thank you. The award, I think, is at bottom a reflection of the kind of advice and mentorship that I have received from bosses, friends, peers, subordinates throughout my time in the Coast Guard. I think that for all the things that I recall being listed in the citation for that award, I can't claim credit for most of it without pointing to those people that taught me those lessons that brought about those experiences. And so it was humbling for sure. It was definitely humbling.
Well, what a wonderful answer. And I think a day of reflection might be a good theme for this episode. There's always these wonderful themes that come out of it. We don't always call them to your attention. I like to let people kind of ponder and think about those themes, but I'll call that one because, well, I brought a delegation of Samar Mexican Navy officers to Sector LA Long Beach, and Stephen was there stationed, and he helped me bring them around and teach them many things and do some training exchanges, as we like to call them. And today, I also had the opportunity to do some preparation work on some future staff talks to build out the plan for the continuous work that we do at the Coast Guard and the Secretary de Marina, or the Mexican Navy, for the future going into 2024 and for the next 5 years. And so the moment of reflection for me is I get to record with Stephen on a day that we look for the future and the relationship, the wonderful relationship with one of our most important partners, the Mexican government. And also today is also we're recording on Pearl Harbor Day. So also another day of just incredible reflection on what it's meant to our country and different things. And also a day of learning for some of the ways we overreacted to some of our citizens in the country for that bombing as well. So, some wonderful learning as well. So just some things. And Stephen just bounced some wonderful ideas on me to talk about some of the lessons he's reflected on upon in his life and he's reflected on as he thought about coming on the episode today. So I just love this first lesson that he talked about, leadership in times of cultural dysfunction. And the way he introduced it to me was talking about how we've all been parachuted in when command climate was bad, or we've had these difficult challenges, or things just weren't working right, or there was just major dysfunction between different cultures, or even maybe something was going on, like the George Floyd shooting happens, and we just didn't know how to deal with that because we'd never had race relations conversations in our life, and we didn't know how to bring those up, or we didn't know how to do so healthily. So, Stephen, talk to us about what you've learned about leadership in times of cultural dysfunction and how we can help the listeners become better about leading and taking care of the people around those in those difficult times.
I'll start by first saying that whenever you get orders to a new unit, first thing you do is you call everybody you know to say, hey, what do you know about this unit? Obviously, many of us, myself included, we'll have done some advanced reconnaissance about what that unit is like and how people like it there, how they like the command. And I remember putting in for a job that was an O5 job. So number one, I never considered it as a job because I was an O4 and a relatively junior O4 at that. And I reached out to one of my mentors and he said, you know what? You should put down the division chief job in Los Angeles for inspections. It's an O5 job, but you should do it. I think you can do it. I owe a lot to the mentor, right? So then I reached out to the unit. I talked to some master chiefs that I knew who had been there, and they're like, oh man, you're putting in for LA. One, it's a meat grinder. Two, people hate each other there right now. Three, the predecessor that was there a couple of tours ago met an incredibly tragic end. And the person sitting in that job that you're applying for actually passed away in the job. And so that was what I was walking into. And, based on some advanced intel from this master chief that I had served with several years prior, or many years prior, in fact. And so I immediately, upon hearing that there were cultural issues, I immediately sought the advice of some mentors. And so I think that's what I first wanted to start out with, to say, look, you know what? At this point that I received orders, I had been an attorney serving in a prosecutorial role and a legal advisor role for the prior 7 years. I've been out of operations. I hadn't done it in almost a decade, and I felt ill-equipped. I felt unprepared to go back in, even though that's exactly what I wanted. So I reached out to my mentors, and I'll name them because I think they deserve to be named here. And so I reached out to Captain Linda Sturgis, who's just a phenomenal leader. And she says, Stephen, stop stressing about it. When you get there, sit down with all of your team, buy them bagels, donuts, and coffee. Just get to know them. Just listen. Stop thinking that you have to fix everything right away. Your job is just to get to know them. And that's what Captain Sturgis told me. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do that. So the story of me going into this unit was literally the story of multiple mentors from across the spectrum. The one who told me to take the job was Commander Moose. May he rest in peace. He passed away shortly after he gave me that piece of advice to reach higher than just an O4 job. And I owe that to him. And I owe a lot to Captain Sturgis, who gave me the advice of, you know what? Stop stressing out. You're going to be fine. Just get to know your people. And I owe a lot to Commander Marshal Newberry, who was my prevention department head. When I sat down with him, I said, sir, I want to meet your expectations. What are your expectations? And he said, I just want you to know your staff and treat them with the respect that they deserve. Right? And to have that kind of leadership and to have that kind of mentorship, to give you a frame of reference to bring to a culture, is such a useful toolkit. Because number one, it requires humility. It requires that, you know what, I don't know anything. I don't know anything about you guys, so I need to learn about you all. And so I took that advice, and you know what? When I came to the unit, there were so many different things happening at that unit. People had gotten into fistfights. There were people getting out in droves. There was a fear based off of a lot of just how the interactions went down between different people on staff. Let me give one concrete example. You know, when you're walking into a culture of dysfunction, when a senior lieutenant comes to you deathly afraid of changing the formatting of the Outlook shared calendar, when it's literally the formatting of the Outlook shared calendar. And this senior lieutenant was just like, I can't do this. I can't. What do you mean? And I was just like, well, what are we talking about here? And so I think the first thing that I learned was I got such great advice from Captain Sturgis. I came in, I was a new division chief. Everybody was like, oh, what is this? What is this new divo going to do? How is it going to make our lives, miserable or not miserable? And I did exactly what Captain Sturgis told me to do, which was, I said, I want to do pay grade meetings. I want to know what's working, what's not working. But more than that, I want to know what your name is, where you're from, what your degree's in, because so many of our junior enlisted personnel are far more educated than I am, have incredibly varied backgrounds, and they bring so much to the table, right? And it's so easy, I think, oftentimes for us to be so mission oriented in the Coast Guard, where we are proud of our DNA of just getting the job done, that it's mission over people. I was blessed to have the opportunity to serve under now Admiral Orr, whose motto is people first is mission success, right? And so taking those pieces of advice and then just getting to know the people and being honest with what I didn't know. I recall sitting down with some peers and they're like, don't tell them what qualities you don't have because they're not going to respect you. And I was just like, this is who I am, right? And if I hide what I have and don't have, I feel like that might make me lose even more credibility. So at any rate, I just went in there and got to know my staff. And it was such a critical time because when I opened up to them and they opened up to me to say, these are their concerns, I immediately realized, one, we do have a culture problem, but two, a lot of it can be resolved with just getting to know each other. And I want to take that one step further, which is in the first 6 months of my job, I had a ton of responsibility in moving the mission forward. The Coast Guard mission is always getting refined, and our responsibility to ensure the safety and the stewardship of the marine transportation system, to make sure that everybody gets their stuff, and also to ensure the economic prosperity of our nation, right? That's a high calling and it's a stressful thing. But what I found myself doing was spending my time during the day with my staff, working with them through different personnel issues, different organizational administrative issues. And then I would do all my missions related work after everybody went home. And it was a heavy toll, but the prioritization of just involving myself with how we could make the day-to-day business administration function easier by getting to know what the choke points were, getting to know what the fear points were, and getting to know where the, oh no, we can't do that, sir, points were, to say, well, why not? Let's try it. And for them to hear, we can try doing something different? Really? And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else and nobody's going to get in trouble for it. Right. And just having that kind of attitude is just like, all right, yeah, let's try something. You've got an idea. It might not be a good idea, but you know what? Let's try it. And if it works, then great. Let's tweak it to make it better. Or if it doesn't work, then let's find something else. That took up the majority of my time. And as all of us who've been in those situations know, like your real work day starts when everybody else goes home. And then you can actually get the king's business done. Right. And so, yeah, I think that times of dysfunction require us to just have that humility and willingness to know our people and willingness to take the time to do things that may not seem immediately mission oriented. But the ultimate consequence is that the mission will get done, right? The mission will get done so much better. That investment may seem inefficient when it comes down to, you know what, we actually have a pretty significant mission to do day to day. And it's time consuming and it's hard and it requires a lot of training. But the more effort that when we're placed in that position of responsibility to find out what is tripping people up, is more than worth the effort. Oftentimes I would walk through the bullpen near the end of the day. I'd like to, just chat with folks. And when there's fewer people in the bullpen, people tend to open up. I'll just say like, hey, how are things going? What's going on? What's working well? And in those conversations, in the 1545 to 1715, in that specific range, I've got a couple of people, stragglers or people who are studying or people who are working on something. Those one-on-one conversations have revealed so much. I realize people aren't going to bring their problems to you. They're just not. Like when you're a division officer and you're talking to an E5, E6, an O2, O1, they're just not going to come to your office and talk to you. You have to go to them, right? And in those conversations, I found out so much about what was happening in the division. But then I would go back to the branch chiefs and I would say, hey, this is what I'm hearing. What are your thoughts on it? And how do you want to tackle it? And they're like, yeah, we totally. And I was like, why aren't we talking about these things? They're happening. People are like upset or people are like, this doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, then let's talk about it. And so just having that kind of investment, I just really credit so much to those leaders and those mentors of mine who took the time to say, like, yeah, you're parachuting into, there might be some troubled waters there, but take the time to get to know your staff. I know it's so elementary, right? But I can say that in light of the next things that happened, that initial 6 months of investment paid off in dividends of trust that were immediately tested with the crises that came afterwards.
Yeah. And it may seem elementary, but sometimes those things, those fear points or those choke points, they might not be the things that you intuitively assume. And like you mentioned a little bit ago, the education levels, they might not be empowered to make those decisions, or they might be afraid to use those education to their fullest extent. And so I just think it's powerful. One of the earliest episodes when I first started this podcast, Scott and Ann Springer, one of the few couples that I had on the podcast together, they talked about how you have to know the divide you're trying to bridge before you can build a bridge. And I just thought that was so profound to say it like that, because so often as leaders, we go try to build a bridge. You know, an engineer would never do that. They would go measure the divide. They would go in and they would know exactly what they were building the bridge for. But as you know, we go into an environment where we're parachuted in, like you said, and we're already like building the bridge that we envision for our environment before we actually know what the real divide is. And so I think, you know, getting to know the people is so important to understand what that real divide is, knowing their education level, their fears, you know, why they've been so dysfunctional, why there's so much animosity on the team, what's created that, what the history is there, what's really driven that in the past, you know, what it is that led to that over so much time. So it could be something small that you might think is meaningless, but somebody doesn't. So you have to work through that, get some conflict management in there and maybe some mediation if needed, and bring those other tools to bear. You mentioned Admiral Orr, and she always talks about so many people come to her for conflict management, but what is the things to the other side of conflict that we can start doing so we can avoid conflict altogether? And so you start to mitigate the conflict now, but then start to build in those tools to avoid future conflict down the road. And that helps by knowing exactly what the teammates need to avoid the conflict. Bring in all these different people from different cultural backgrounds, and they might be just communicating in different ways, and they can be getting offended for no reason when they're just trying to say different things in different ways. And so if we can help them communicate in different ways and understand what they're communicating, that can mean a lot of different things. I spent today watching a group of bilingual speakers dissect the words coordinate and what was the other word? It was bad though, but for 40 minutes they just trying to pick the right word. So believe me, we sometimes think we're communicating and we're not really communicating. And so so it's important, right, to make sure that we're really communicating at the right level, because we make a lot of assumptions day to day that can lead to a lot of that dysfunction.
I think that we have to know where we're making assumptions. We make so many assumptions. Look, in a Coast Guard, we have so many stereotypes. One of my big pet peeves is we have stereotypes. Oh, BMs are like this, or MKs are like this, or MSTs, the different rates, right? We have so many stereotypes, right? And to get past those stereotypes, the ability to get past those stereotypes and get to know the people creates the amount of depth of water where we as leaders have the rudder to make small adjustments, right? But if you don't know your people, then you're making wild rudder swing adjustments, and you're gonna find yourself hard aground somewhere pretty quickly, right? But if you know your people, that gives you that depth to say, all right, like let's just make a little adjustment here. Or let's just, hey, have somebody go have a quick conversation with that person. And maybe they don't need to hear from me. They need to hear from somebody else. They need to hear from their shipmate. They need their shipmate to hold them accountable. They don't want the 04 or 05 holding them accountable, right? They feel like their career's over if that happens, right? And so it gives you the ability to make those small rudder angle changes to kind of steer the ship into safer waters.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're using a lot of Coast Guard lingo, but this is the same for any organization, whether you have, real junior members of your organization and middle managers and senior level executives and different members, whether they're, you might bring in someone with a high level education that comes in at a real junior level because they are trying to get a new start and a new different job type. Yeah. And so if you have these people, And this is why a lot of times people are afraid to take a chance on someone with a high level education because they're worried they're going to get bored or want to leave too soon. Well, maybe they really want to start out in that type of industry. And sometimes you have to give them a chance, but maybe listen to them a little bit more, explore their ideas, or help them have that curiosity to continue to grow and find ways to empower them to help you be a better leader as well. It's like they can continue to grow at that experience level, but you can also grow as well in your level of management or leadership that you're at in your organization as well. And so while we talk about the enlisted versus the officer corps and the military, the Coast Guard in this example, there's definite translation into any organization that you're working in.
Yeah.
And now, just so we have time, we could probably talk about this one leadership lesson forever, but I want to move on to the next one because it's got so much just power. Unfortunately for Stephen, but fortunately for the rest of us, Stephen has dealt with a ton of tragedy in his career. And so he's learned to have just these powerful, impactful, thoughtful moments to reflect upon what it means to lead in these moments of tragedy. So, Stephen, you had this time in your leadership journey where you had 3 years in a row where you lost someone you were leading. So, can you talk to us about how that felt, what you learned from that?
No, I think that I don't wish those experiences on anybody. I know many of us have lost shipmates, and it doesn't ever get easier. More experience doesn't make that kind of experience, doesn't help you, I think, in the same way that you might think it might. I'll just say this. So the 6 months after I arrived at the unit, one of my petty officers, one of our junior members, passed away from cancer. And I had just started to get to know the team. And I think that it was the point in time where we needed to really, well, let me just set the stage, right? This is fall of 2018, beginning of 2019. And we are in the midst of a government shutdown in which the Coast Guard active duty members serving the public are not getting paid, putting their lives on the line every single day, ensuring the safety and security of our maritime transportation system, of the public, doing search and rescue cases, law enforcement cases, and they're not getting paid. And we're having to put together food pantries for our members. We're having to find ways to help each other pay their rent. And in the midst of this, one of our best petty officers passes away. He has 2 young children. And I think that in that moment, I saw the reaction of the different members of my team. And everybody has a different reaction. Some people they just go into go mode. They're like, I need to do something. I need to do something. And other people like, I can't do anything. I can't do anything at all. And when we're in a leadership position responsible for the well-being, the welfare, and the execution of the mission, and you lose a member of the team, it puts into such rapid focus what your priorities are. Because yes, we have an incredibly important mission, and that's the DNA of Coasties. We take so much pride in the value we bring to the American public every single day. But when you lose one of your own, you start questioning, how valuable is everything that I'm doing in light of how I'm feeling right now? What I felt convicted of at that time was that I needed to show up for my people. And it didn't mean that I needed to show up to be strong necessarily, because I was devastated. And then I saw my chief and how devastated he was. And I saw my team and the kind of response from the team of people who, none of whom were getting paid, to rally together to get a meal train going for the widow, to make sure that we do honors for the member, to go and work through all the processes that the Coast Guard has to take care of the family. It was incredible. And I think what I learned from that first experience was, one, I needed to show up, but two, it wasn't necessarily my job to be the one doing everything. I needed to let my team have the space, that the ones who needed to do something, to give them the space to do it, right? I think oftentimes leaders gravitate to taking all the responsibility and then saying, well, I need to do this. I have to do this. This is my role. And I think ultimately what it was showing up for the family, showing up for the team, and being there was simply the role that I needed to take. And I needed to take a step back to let those folks who were closer with the team, who had known the member much longer than I did, to be able to grieve in action, or to be able to grieve in inaction, and to give them that space to do it while being there for them at the same time. It was a very delicate thing. And I could sense myself being like, oh, I need to do this. I need to do this. And then something else told me, you know what? Your team, they care. They care, and let them care, and let them know you care, but you don't have to do all those things. And so that tragedy made the team so incredibly tight. It was already a tight team, but it brought everybody closer together in a way that I really couldn't imagine. And especially because of the context of the government shutdown. Following year, immediately after that, a member of the same team, another member, a more senior member of the same team, who had been going through a lot of trouble. And, don't think we can come close to underestimating the need for mental health professionals and services and resources in the Coast Guard. I just want to emphasize that as much as I possibly can, because this member, who was an outstanding performer, just absolutely a rock star, took his own life 3 months into the COVID pandemic after shutting down, after the entire world shut down. And everybody was already going through so much stress. We didn't know whether this virus was going to kill us at that time. We were deathly afraid of just scrubbing our groceries when we got them. Remember that time? This is that time. And we were all in our homes, all isolated from each other. And then we found out that one of our members took his own life, and his son was the one that found him. And and especially after having just lost another member, we had to caster up the entire department. We just said, you know what, we can't. And there was managing the guilt. Everybody was asking themselves, well, what could I have done? Managing the anger. There was so much anger that we felt towards ourselves, oftentimes that we felt towards one another, and not being able to get together. So the lesson learned there was, you know what? Yeah, we were in the middle of a pandemic. We didn't know what we could do or what we couldn't do to keep each other safe. But ultimately, we made the decision. It's like, you know what? We're going to let everybody know in person. So I remember we split up the command team within the division. We said, we're just going to drive to everybody's house and let everybody know. Because if we were shipmates, risks, yes, they were out there, but you know what? We'll just find a way. So we called everybody and we went and notified everybody in the team in person. And I think that was a necessity of showing up, even though the county rules may not have necessarily permitted it. We all did it outside, right? We asked people to come outside. But I think the basic things, you want to take care of the family, yes. But what I went through during that time of the suicide was, how do we take care of each other? The number of phone calls that I made and that I received, and I was humbled to receive. My senior wards were calling me to check on me. My junior petty officers were calling me to check on me. I was calling them, right? And to see that kind of intentionality go up and down the chain, I think it was cathartic. And then we gone through the same process. We wanted to make sure that we took care of the member's spouse, started the food train. The team got together, noted the birthdays for the kids, and we would always, for the subsequent 3 years, right? So long as I was at that unit, we had members who still knew that, the member that had passed, and we would always buy them Christmas presents, birthday presents. We would invite them to Coast Guard Day and things of that nature, just to keep the memory of our shipmate alive for each other and for them. And then finally, being okay with asking for help. As leaders, we feel like there's so much responsibility that's on our shoulders. And ultimately, being able to reach out to the staff, I think that it's taking away the stigma. Admiral Sugimoto does this incredibly well, taking away the stigma of asking for a mental health professional for help, just to talk, right? And that was incredibly important. And then finally, in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, I had a JG who was tragically shot in a freak accident in an outdoor range. Less than a year after the more senior petty officer passed away. And I was just like, you never want that call. I was on leave, and I knew that if the assistant chief was calling me, something was really, really wrong. And when I found out what had happened, it was the hardest 3 years of my career. It was the hardest 3 years of my career. And that instance was where I learned that people don't just recover. I had a member who was so close with the member who had been shot. And how do we look out for each other? How do we memorialize the people that have impacted us? And how do we reach out to their families? And in the last instance, this member was just one of the most charismatic, one of the most positive human beings, one of the most encouraging. The impact that he had on his shipmates just was felt so broad. And I think that all of us felt inadequate on the manner in which we wanted to honor him. And I think ultimately what we ended up taking up was the effort to name one of the building spaces on base after this member because of the amount of work that he poured into being an ESO. You know, at the memorial, junior member after junior member would come up and say, you know what, LT, he was always getting on me for going to, finish my degree and pursuing more. And, this is the impact. So we ended up being able to name, doing the work and putting together a ceremony for the member's family and naming this building the building space after him. I mean, it was the least we could do, but the impact that it had on his family, the impact that it had on all of the members who were benefited by this member's just passion for improving others was something that helped us grieve better. It doesn't ever become easier. It really doesn't. But what it does is it reveals to us. I have this rock in my office. We went through, Charlie Coiro teaches this course, this leadership principles course. And one of those things is, oh, you got your rock. I have my rock. And what I wrote on my rock, it's in front of my monitors in my computer. And it has a question. The question is, what's really important? And then underneath that question, I have the names of those 3 members that passed away. And what it reminds me is every single time I'm struggling because my computer won't load or the network is down or what have you, or whatever administrative or bureaucratic function that I'm struggling with that day, I see that rock and it's just like, all right, what's really important here? And it helps me reframe, right? Because what's really important is how we show up for one another. And I remember going into a really dark place after the 3rd member passed away. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I couldn't sleep at night. And I found myself just in front of my computer and I wrote a letter to my entire division. And I was just like, look, guys, I'm really struggling. Every single day I wake up and I feel like I'm falling down, even though I'm standing up. I'm standing at my desk and I'm typing, but I feel like I'm watching myself type. I'm not really here. I feel like I need to be here for all y'all, but I'm really hurting, you guys. I just needed to explain it to people where I was at. And, and I sent it to my entire division. So I was like, well, these are the people I'm as close to these people as I have been any other unit. Right. And I sent it out to everybody. And the response that I got back was just so overwhelming, Keith, and how they were dealing, right? And I was talking to my email about this is what I remember. This is how I want to remember this member. And they were telling me, this is what I'm doing, and this is how I am. And what a powerful, though tragic, what a powerful experience it is for us to be able to lift each other up by saying what our struggles are and not necessarily oversharing, right? But just to say, hey, this is where I'm at right now. And, I really appreciate you giving me a hand. And if you need a hand, I'm here. I want to do that because it'll help me as well. So we went through a lot in those 3 years, Keith, and it taught me so much about what matters. I remember when I was an ensign and I had an MK3 and he's like, sir, don't sweat the small stuff. He's like, you're always sweating the small stuff. It's like, sir, stop sweating the small stuff. And I was just like, I remember that, from 20 years ago. And I was like, yeah, you know what? You're right. Stop sweating the small stuff. We can show up for one another.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I mean, such a hard 3 years. There's no doubt about it. There's no way to put it into words. There's no way to say that I understand. There's no way to understand. It's just hard. I just love the way you talked about it. I love the way you honored those individuals in your words and your actions. I love the way you gave permission for people to feel leadership through example. I think about there's so many domino effects that come from that. There's things that happen when you have one type of incident like that you have to deal with. There's things that happen when you have a second, but a third, then you start to have things like, well, this division's cursed. This, you start to have these things like people talk, you have these things that happen. Well, I don't want to go to that unit now. So you have all these different things that pop up and you have to manage this different type of issue that you've never been taught to manage before, because these aren't things that you put into any type of operational manual about. Like, these are just things that happen because of human nature and the way that we avoid death and the way we deal with it. And like you said, some people, they deal with going into hyperdrive and maybe sometimes avoidance. Not that everybody that deals by doing is avoiding, but some are. And, some they freeze and some just start processing, and all these different emotions that are happening through either reflection or freezing or processing or avoiding, or the gambit in between, right? And that's just a small snippet of different processing collection. On my rock that you mentioned in the senior leadership transition course, and there's many more, but that's where I got my rock. My was reflect, and which was one of our themes, because I think that's a powerful one. The power, the gift that is life, I think comes to mind real quickly when you mention something like this, and just the opportunity to treasure those experiences of the people around you and the team, and just how you bring those people together. I think the gift of weeding out the dysfunction, so that when you do have some tragedy, because any type of tragedy is going to magnify dysfunction. I think that what you talked about, the first example, especially how the team came together, I don't know that happens in a dysfunctional team. And so I think that where you started from, I think that helps, and just some powerful thoughts there. And I
think we have to be intentional, right, Keith?
Yeah. Yeah.
What I mean by that is, and I don't mean to, I want to be very clear that I don't mean to misuse the memory of those shipmates that we've lost. I think we have to be very careful about that, and to, especially knowing the families and respecting their wishes. But I found myself in every single check-in I did after those years with new people coming to the unit, I would be very clear, because I needed them to know, as a department head, that there are people who are suffering here, right? People have lost in a significant way. And this is in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And to all the things that went through during that time. And so from junior to senior, as they came in, I said, look, we just lost 3 members year after year after year. And what I need you to understand about how we do business here is, yes, we are going to serve the American people, but our priority is each other, and we are going to show up for one another. Because what you're going to remember from this unit, in addition to the great work that you do every single day and the professionalism with which you do it, what you are going to remember is how we showed up for one another. That's what every single unit that I've been to, I've carried with me, like the people who showed up and how they showed up for each other, right? And no, we're all different, but I think that we need to be able to be our authentic selves when we show up, and then you're going to have something special there. And that doesn't just come by accident. It's something we have to be intentional about. And you know what? It's also something that we have to hold ourselves accountable to, that when we're not showing up in a way that we need for each other to be in accordance with our core values, we have to hold each other. And as leaders, we have to hold ourselves and our subordinates and peers accountable to that. It can't just be talk, in other words, right? And that accountability is, I had an officer who was prior BM, and she would always be like, sir, you're too nice. You need to stick it. And I took that to heart, and I learned a lot from her, right? And so we need to be careful on both sides of that equation. That's all.
No, that's a great thought, and I love it. And you jogged my memory of something where I was going, because I loved in that first example of how you gave them the power to feel what they were feeling and to take their own action, and you step back. That I thought that was so powerful, of where you realized that your role was to be present, but not to feel for them. And I just, and I'm using my words, not the words you used, just to be clear. That's the way I, in my mind, was interpreting it. But I just love that. And I think, these are three just profound examples that are really hard to fathom for a lot of people out there that maybe haven't had as much loss. But there's so many things that you talked about in your second example, the need for mental health. Many people are going through tragedies every day, and suffering and challenges. And we're not called to be mental health professionals by any stretch of the imagination. But I think your call to be intentional is relevant here. And we can use this example to be mental health aware, to be leaders that are watchers, leaders that can be not just looking out for people not doing their job, but maybe, is there something different about this person? Is this person performing differently instead of just not performing? And maybe there's something going on that is, I should ask better questions before I just assume they're not wanting to be here or not wanting to perform. And I can get to the root of something, because maybe they've had a death in the family. Maybe there's some sort of issue going on or maybe they're struggling, or maybe they're just having some sort of depression, or maybe they've have a divorce they're going through, or they're just even something that their teenage child just has decided they don't want anything to do with them, and they're having depression about it. Many gamuts of things that are out there, but then you can help to understand and point them in the direction of getting someone to talk to about it, where they can be productive again. And having those discussions and being a source of where you can bounce ideas off of, and being a safe space to help get them productive. And I'm not saying that, going back to your authentic point, that everybody has to be the listening and sounding board if that's not authentic to them. But I'm just saying we can be a little bit more intentional about being mental health aware and getting people to the right sources that will be those good sounding boards that they can work with.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that, I just want to leave that with my challenge for this episode. I just think that I'd like to challenge us to look for opportunities to be more mental health aware, to be more looking out for people, to see the good in people, even when they're not performing. Like, think about ways, what's different about their performance, to look for opportunities to ask insightful questions, to think about, why did we bring this employee into our team in the first place? So what was it about them? Because that could help us look for differences in their demeanor, their change. And that might help us to understand what changed in them so that we can approach them differently. Because it could be, maybe there's something going on the team, a conflict, going back to the dysfunction discussion. Maybe there's a tragedy. So if we think about that person and why we brought them onto our team, and being more intentional about them, we might be able to understand a little bit what's changed that performance, or something about that. And we can ask better questions to get them performing at a better level. Or maybe it's something that we are doing in our leadership that's driving that poor performance as well. So we can understand what's going on there. And I just want to leave that for the challenge, to think more intentional about the people around us. All right, let's move on to maybe build some, maybe not so, they won't be happier thoughts. I wanted to say some happier thoughts, but they'll probably be just as tough of thoughts for people. And these challenges, they might be tough for us to think about, but we're talking about some of these tougher issues because Stephen's got such great experience that I just really feel that if we can help you get through some of these more challenging, complicated, and complex issues, you can help have some real things in your toolbox to reach into and think about ways you can help bring people to the table in different ways, and think about complexity in a new way and with curiosity that will help you approach people and circumstances differently, so that you can have more joy in the everyday around you, not stress about things when they might come up that might not be the normal. And so then we'll move right into this category of leadership in times of ambiguity. So, you had some really just a great example case with some cruise ships during COVID, right at the start of COVID, that I think, everybody, well, I can't say everybody, that's probably a stretch, but a lot of people love to go on cruise ships. And I know that myself and a lot of people I talked to are watching cruise ships during COVID and wondering what is the future of cruise ships after COVID. So it was a big discussion point with a lot of people is what's going to be the future of cruise ships after COVID. I know that was a lot of talking points with people I talked to, and so this was a big thing. But you had some experience right in the beginning of processing that, and that was must have been challenging. So what was it like to get some of the first cruise ships coming into the United States, and how did you handle that? And you were also really one of the key decision makers in this, really on the front line. So talk to the listeners about that as well.
Yeah, there's so many lessons here. And I think it's important to set the scene. So let's start. It is March of 2020. We hear about the COVID-19 virus. There's rumors, there's a lot of hand wringing, there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know how lethal it is. We don't have all the science behind the disease. We think people are just dropping dead in the streets in China. And we're hearing these reports, and all of this kind of culminates in the media reporting regarding the Diamond Princess. Remember, the Diamond Princess was that cruise ship in Japan that had the COVID outbreak. And it was just kind of this tipping point. Maybe there were multiple tipping points, right? But it was this tipping point in the consciousness, the public consciousness of what's going on. And then we see how that situation unfolded in Japan and on the West Coast, because we see the COVID-19 pandemic originating in Asia. West Coast is the natural starting point for any kind of transportation coming into the West Coast from Asia. There's a lot of anxiety there. And then we hear about the situation with the Royal Princess, as you might recall, with COVID positive passengers coming into San Francisco. So that's the scene that we're setting. Everybody is kind of on edge. Nothing significant from a government standpoint as far as shutdown has happened yet. It's the first week of March. We're in LA. I am outside at my son's soccer game, and I get a call from the command center and my captain saying, "Hey, there is a cruise ship coming in that may have symptomatic passengers and crew members. Some of these crew members may have transferred from the Royal Princess, which is the case up in San Francisco." We're in Los Angeles and Long Beach, by the way. And so I say, "Yes, ma'am," headed into the office right now. I leave drop my son off at home and run into the office. And I get the word that the White House has directed that these two cruise ships that are coming in, one with symptomatic passenger, the other one with potential crew from the Royal Princess, were not to disembark passengers. Now, this is Los Angeles. There are thousands of people on this cruise. These two cruise ships are both scheduled to arrive that day. This is Saturday, the second weekend of March. And there are 4,000 people on one cruise ship, over 2,000 on the other. And then there are 4,000 people that are waiting to get onto the cruise ship and 2,000 waiting to get onto the other cruise ship. And there is a well-orchestrated dance across local agencies, federal agencies, port authorities, and commercial companies on how this happens on a regular basis. And as I walk into the office, I hear my captain issue the verbal captain of the port order directing the vessel to not come to berth with their full complement of passengers. And then at that point, when my captain turns to me and says, "Stephen, you got it." Serving as the incident commander, coordinating the details for all of the subsequent fallout of the situation. And I remember standing there. We're standing up in an incident management team. We have Customs and Border Patrol coming. We have LA Port Police coming. We have Long Beach Fire. We have all the agencies. They're all coming to the Coast Guard. And everybody shows up in the room and they're like, "All right, what do we do?" Because we have a playbook, right? There is a plan for pandemic type situations. And there are specific procedures. However, the playbook that we had was built off of prior cases that did not fit the scale of what was happening here. In that moment, everybody turned around to each other and said, well, here's what I have to offer. Here's what we can do, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, what I learned in that type of situation where there was ambiguity, there were these cruise ships, there were these thousands of passengers waiting to get off. There were these thousands of passengers trying to get off, and everybody is terrified of everything. And I gathered everybody in the room. I said, you know what? First thing, here's what we're going to do. We're all going to go around the room. We're all going to introduce ourselves and say what our role is, what our name is, what our agency is, and what authorities we have. Of course, being in the port, most of us knew each other already, but not everybody knew everybody. So just getting through the initial fear, anxiety, and adrenaline that everybody has about a situation to go back to something we know very well. So we all go around, right? Like if I could ever plug the Coast Guard's incident command system, having a working, not just working, but having a good functional knowledge of how ICS works is, in my opinion, one of the basic building blocks of being able to take chaos and put a framework on it. And it is the language, the interagency language that we speak that allows us to be able to insert direction, framework, and leadership ultimately into this situation. And so as we stood there, number one lesson I learned is everybody is looking to the Coast Guard for leadership in the maritime arena. Everybody has a piece of authority. All those different agencies had a piece of authority. They were all important and needed to be in the room, right? We had that question of like, who has the right authorities and so on. And we determined that everybody should be there. But I saw that there was a desire from all the agencies for direction. They wanted to be told what to do. And they expected the Coast Guard to be able to step up and say, hey, this is what we're going to do. In every single leader's career as a leader, there comes a point where you are faced with a moment. That moment, identifying the moment and stepping up to the moment and correctly capturing what is needed in that moment, I believe is a trained skill. When we have situations of ambiguity, all the different cases that we work every single day in our career, we should be trained with a language, with framework, and then with the courage to be able to grab that moment and say, this is what this moment needs. And so in that moment, one, I was blessed with a command that empowered me to take those actions. And two, what I found was necessary was this is how we are going to define what success is in this space. What success is in this space is twofold. One, we have to carry out the orders of the White House. That's clear, right? But two, our success depends on information messaging, right? So there was the functional thing that we had to do. We had to keep everybody off those ships and keep all the people who were coming onto the ships we weren't supposed to allow them onto the ships. And we had to figure out when we could let everybody come off and let everybody go on, right? And we had to find out who had to have the authority. So we have this rubric called ACCCP, right? Like who has the authority to tell, who has the capability, who has the competency, right? So on and so forth. What partnerships can we use? We had that. We figured out very quickly, okay, look, we know that the CDC is the agency with the authority and the subject matter expertise to be able to say whether or not this person is clear with COVID or not COVID. Once we determine that, then we can let all the regular symphony of machinery within the port structure work. That was the simple answer. But we had to properly define what our fight was. And I stepped up and I said, our fight is communicating the simple thing to everybody so everybody knows what to expect. And people were angry because they couldn't get off the ship and they were tweeting or Xing, whatever it's called now, right? They were tweeting. They were sending notes to the media. We stood up the Emergency Operations Center. I was like, number one purpose is to let everybody know what decisions are being made, who's making those decisions, and how do we make those decisions. And guess what? 3 months prior to this situation happening, I decided to reach out to the CDC director in our area to come to the Coast Guard to provide training on what to do in the event of a salmonella outbreak on the ship, something so simple. So having already built the relationship with the CDC to train us, I was like, oh, Dr. Tardeville, we need to call Dr. Tardeville. She was the CDC director, the quarantine office director for the LA office. And is still. And having that relationship and being able to call her up to say, look, you are the correct agency. She was unavailable to come in person, but took on the responsibility for decision making, got that to the right agency. And then we spent the rest of our time communicating up the chain, back up to the White House, out to the different agencies, and then out to the media, what we were doing. Ultimately, there was no news story, even though there were upwards more than 10,000 people who were displaced that evening until we got the test results back the subsequent day. So what success looked like was that there was no major outrage that we had delayed these cruise ships for this amount of time with thousands of people in America's busiest container port. And the lessons learned in how closely those agencies then subsequently worked together for the following 2 years of ships coming in and out, continuing to move commerce to the United States, right? 30% of America's container cargo comes through LA. That's a significant portion of our economy. If we can't figure out how to do that right, we're not doing the American public justice. And what we needed to do was to identify the moment, find the decision maker, find the right authorities for that decision maker, and then define what the priorities were and what battle we were actually fighting. Yes, we were fighting COVID, but we were really fighting an information battle. Only thought that we were fighting COVID and neglected the information side, I think potential type of failure in the fear and anxiety and potential misinformation that it would have caused in that port complex would have had severe consequences.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you would have just said you were fighting COVID, that's not a winnable fight. You can't do anything with that, right? So I think that structure that you laid out, this when you're fighting ambiguity, right? You gave it some structure. I love that way you said that. You stepped back and took it to something everyone knew. Now you used ICS as your model, but it can be anything. Using something that everyone knew, a little introduction, get to know everyone, and taking that step back. It's interesting. Reflecting back myself, your first discussion point about leading in dysfunction and talking about the government shutdown, when you're talking about people close to not getting paid, I actually deployed to the Philippines to teach ICS while not getting paid. So I love ICS, Incident Command System, and teaching it. The Filipino Coast Guard and National Police and Customs and Enforcement, they actually created their own ICS system to mirror ours in the United States because they believe in it as well. So they have their own incident management handbook that's similar to ours. And so it's interesting that we've taught it in other countries and they've started doing similar things. They can't do it exactly like ours because of the different authorities, but it's going back to what you were saying is looking at who had the authority to do what and what was that what was success? Like what was that? How do you get to success? Because ambiguity, if you don't know what success is, you're going to continue to fight something like COVID, which you're not going to win against a virus in something like at that point in time, we didn't even know what that really was. And so that was so important. I think that just goes such a long way. And it's so crucial to so many of us that are in leadership roles in so many different organizations to think about those different things that you talked about there and reflect upon going back through all those things that you dialogued about it, and just so many profound lessons there. I just loved it. And then the last one is ICS is such a great segue to it because it goes hand in hand with us in the Coast Guard. When we think about leadership in times of crisis, I almost think automatically Incident Command System because that's just the language we use. It's like you said, it's all the federal government agencies. It's how we speak the same language. We use the same forms to a degree. Thing about leadership and the discussion of servant leadership that might be fun for leadership in times of crises, because as a servant leader, how much extra burden do we put on our people in times of crisis? And I've observed over time at how much effort we put into overburdening our personnel, whether in times of crises, just to review extra paperwork and do different things. And so going back to the last discussion about what is success, where do we get these talking points, or what are we driving at? Where are we putting our lines of effort at? These are important discussions. It was a reflection point for me because as he was talking about these cruise ship terminals, I could envision them because I was with the Mexican Navy officers in those cruise ship terminals, visiting them a few years back. And today I was looking at lines of effort today with some of those same Mexican Navy officers. And so, but in some of those lines of effort weren't as efficient as they could have been. And so I think in a crisis, we have to be as efficient as possible because you have stress levels that are high. You have different things. So what have you learned about leadership in times of crisis that could help us take those lines of effort and be as efficient as possible, or to lower those stress levels for the people that are with us, or to strengthen the teams that are with us?
Yeah. Number one, what I appreciate in those situations is trust. My command trusted me with the agency partners to lead that room. I think trust and empowerment. What's needed in crisis is decision-making, framework, authority, understanding the battle space. These are all things that are needed in crisis. And you won't get decision-making unless people are placed in positions to make those decisions and are empowered to do so. Unless the people who are placed in the decision-making space are empowered to make those decisions without having to go back and ask for permission, you are not going to get decisions. And decisions are important. They're time sensitive. They are time sensitive in crisis. If you don't make a decision on time, that's the difference between failure and success. So if your people aren't empowered to make those decisions, then you're not going to succeed in different ways when time is of the essence. So number one, what is it that gives people the willingness to trust other people to make decisions? How do you earn that trust? How do you maintain that trust? How do you ensure the credibility of the organization is maintained? Developing that trust relationship is the foundation for that. If there's no trust relationship, then people will not be empowered. And then if people are not empowered, you don't get the decision that you need. And then the reputation of the agency is staked on that as well. If the person that is being put into the decision-making position then has to go back and say, may I have permission XYZ? Maybe it's required. So don't take anything away that if it's statutorily required or required by regulation, then we have to defer to the authority that does that, right? Like only the captain of the port can make captain of the port orders, right? Like we should be very clear about that. But being able to make decisions with your federal partners builds the credibility in the agency where the federal partners will come back to you for the next problem and then continue to build that relationship. It's such an incredibly important space. And so number one, having the right people empowered to make the decision, and then the willingness to make a decision, because making a decision is hard, right? It's easier oftentimes just to go execute. Making a decision means that you're accountable to it in front of your peers, in front of the agencies, and frankly, in front of the media and the public. And when you do that, you have to own it. And there are consequences. Everybody has their own political equity at stake on many decisions that impact all of the infrastructure, especially in a port infrastructure, in a port ecosystem. Understanding different people's equities. What is an agency's equity and priority? And knowing that ahead of time, having the relationships, knowing who to call, all of these things are all wrapped in one. But really what it boils down to, trust, credibility, and decision-making. You have to be able to step up into that space. And to say if there's a gap, to be able to identify it and to say, look, we don't have a policy and process in place from the CDC in the second week of March on how to manage ships coming in with symptomatic people. We have a general, we had some executive decisions to say, hey, nobody's coming in. But practically speaking, are we going to turn all these ships away? How are we going to process them in and out? And so we had to develop a process. And part of what ended up happening as a part of the Jarvis Award was one of the efforts that we undertook in that time was to work with the CDC to develop specific protocols and recommendations for ships coming in with different cases and having a framework, being able to say, look, this is how we're going to approach it on a consistent, repeatable basis that all of the agencies involved in this system know what to expect. And that's what we ended up doing. And we did it by including the CDC, of course, because they are the federal agency with authority to make decisions as it relates to public health situations. But we also did it in consultation with the shipping companies and the port stakeholders. And had we made the decision in a vacuum with just the federal partners, but not include the shipping agencies, their shipping companies themselves, who said, this isn't practical or this is not achievable, like in any stretch of the imagination. So by bringing the shipping companies, which as a federal regulator, we had a relationship with, and then bringing in the federal agency, and then, the Coast Guard exercising that power to convene, we got together and created this thing, this policy. I shouldn't call it a thing, this policy, these recommendations that were vetted through the CDC headquarters and then put out to all of the mariners so that they knew what to expect. That is how we got through the pandemic. And so being able to build those relationships, build trust, get to the decision points by the right people with the right people in the room to execute on something that ultimately impacted the American public such that they were still able to get the PPE that they needed, to get the supplies that they needed, to go on that Amazon binge that they wanted to go on. That was our role, right? And that was, and finding that space and getting there, it wasn't easy. The shipping companies just wanted to do whatever they wanted to do. And, we found ourselves in a lot of uncharted waters, but being able to leverage those basic principles, I think, helped get us to where we needed to be.
I love that. It's such good things to think about. I think I'm glad I was never stationed with you when I think about it, because if if those things weren't big enough, you also had that big supply chain backup too in LALB as well. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a big oil spill at the same time. And I'm no stranger to oil spills, but I don't think I'd want one during a big supply chain backup as well. So talk about that as well, and how you kind of, what you learned about leadership at times of crisis from that example.
Oh, you don't even know. I think you hit on a really important principle, which is never to be stationed with me, because I seem to attract disaster and catastrophe. If I may deviate from your question just for a quick second, on December 7th, today is December 7th, on December 7th, 2007, the Costco Busan, which is a 900-foot ship, ran into the Bay Bridge in the fog in the early morning hours and caused a giant oil spill. And Lieutenant J.G. Bor was the command duty officer for that case. Costco Busan is very infamous within the Coast Guard. That was my case.
I had no idea you were on Costco Busan.
That was my watch. That was my watch. Then I went to Corpus Christi and a barge blew up while I was on the phone with the owner, who wanted to gas free the barge by putting dry ice under a bucket under the expansion dome, and said, "Oh, it's fine. My buddy can just weld it with the dry ice in the bucket." And then I heard boom, and catastrophe seems to follow me everywhere I go. So I'm hiding right now, I suppose. Maybe they don't want me in an operational unit. What I learned from the Costco Busan was that you can do an oil spill textbook perfect and not win the public messaging battle. What you say about what you do is just as important, if not more important, than carrying out the professional work with which you were trained to do. That's what I learned from the Costco Busan. That stuck with me throughout all the things that we're talking about. And what I learned in the oil spill. So this now fast forward back to 2021. This is the end of September of 2021. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we had an exceptional, I hate using the word unprecedented because it's been overused so much, but we had the largest supply chain backlog in history in the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach. We had 180 plus ships waiting in the queue to come offload cargo because of the supply chain backup. We were all over CNN. So off of Huntington Beach, you could see hundreds of container ships backed up, drifting within 3 nautical miles of each other with their engines off. And everybody's coming out of the pandemic now that we had the vaccine, and the Great Pacific Air Show, the Huntington Beach Air Show was happening. So we had thousands of wreck vessels out there with the backdrop of these container ships, hundreds of container ships sitting. And then we get a call. I'm with my kids at the air show, and I get a call that there's what appears to be a incredibly long, heavy oil slick that is moving towards the air show, where there are just thousands of people. It was one crisis after the next. And the manner in which Admiral Orr and the rest of the leadership rallied and placed structure on the chaos, got involved, made sure that we went through what we were required to do, coordinating the port coordination team to make sure that we're working with all of the partners. When those points of crisis happen, number one, recognizing what is expected of you in your role. Number two, having the willingness to say, you know what, this is what I was trained for and this is what I'm getting paid for. So whatever else I have going on immediately becomes second priority and I'm going to show up. And number three, getting your team to understand not just the mission at hand with executing the operation, but making sure we communicate correctly, understanding the political sensitivities that are at play, how we message what we're doing out. So in this case, we, the Coast Guard, were responsible both for responding to the oil spill and working with the responsible party, which is the name, the regulatory name that we provide to the person that whose oil was spilled, working together with them. And yet at the same time, we are statutorily required to conduct a marine casualty investigation into what happened, which creates a lot of, potential political consequences. And bringing in the right team to be able to tackle this problem and to be able to identify what is necessary for the Coast Guard to bring national experts to bear, to bring in the cavalry to make sure that we're executing this the right way, because the consequences are significant. Because everybody is already looking at the extraordinary backup and everybody is seeing that it's taking so much longer for them to get their stuff. And on top of that, you have an oil spill. So the terrifying prospect of potentially shutting down a port, which is already backed up, and the potential consequences of hamstringing those parts of the port, including the great professionals who work at the Marine Exchange, who manage the traffic, and dealing with all of those inquiries at the same time, made it incredibly important that we had to approach what we were doing with extreme deliberation. So in that time, having the right communication up the chain to make sure that our leadership, our Coast Guard senior leadership, were equipped with the right information to answer the questions from those in Congress who were asking questions of what the Coast Guard is doing, may not, to my team, have felt a necessary part of doing a marine casualty investigation. But that was absolutely and critically important that we keep the right people informed of the manner in which we execute our jobs so that we have the confidence of Congress. We have the confidence of the public so that when we go out and shut down ports, which we did in this case, when we go out and have to communicate to our international partners, the Mexican Navy, the Mexican government, about the oil that's coming their way. When we go out and talk to the commercial vessel operators who couldn't go out because the oil slick was out there, the manner in which we communicated what we did, those were the lessons that I took from Costco Busan. We are going to proactively state the narrative of what the Coast Guard is doing and how we're doing it. That's what success looks like. I know I keep on repeating myself, but those lessons were learned at a high cost.
They were, and you mentioned Costco Busan, and I just can't be overstated that how much that message is embedded in the Coast Guard DNA when it comes to pollution response and how much we talk about it. And I think that it can't go overstated enough because it's just a good lesson for every organization to talk about public messaging. And when we talked about knowing what success is, it's important to know that, success is defined in many different ways, whether when we talk about in the incident management world, there's the incident itself, and then there's also the public messaging of the incident. And so there's the two different things. And so oftentimes you can have this, whether it's in a public perception, you have whatever's going on in your company, but then there's the public perception of what's going on. And so those can be two separate things, but you have to manage both those at the same time. Yeah. And so, that's important to understand that oftentimes those take different approaches. but you have to manage those simultaneously. And it's interesting. One of the things that Stephen's talking about here is this marine casualty investigation and oil spill response that many people aren't aware of. Those come from different statutory authorities that the Coast Guard owns. And they just hear Coast Guard, but they don't realize that we're doing under those different authorities and that there's different people doing them. And so that there's not a mingling of those authorities in any instance, but the public doesn't usually know that. And we work very hard to message that very well. This identification of the responsible party is because we have the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 that amended the Clean Water Act. It requires the polluter to pay for the pollution that they caused. That's what the law does. It's a polluter pays law. And so the responsible party is such that they're identified because they have to pay for it. And so they're brought to the table because they pay for the response activity. So they're part of it to be there so they can they can foot the bill. And so it's interesting because they're with the Coast Guard or the EPA if it's in the inland zone, Coast Guard in the coastal zone, but they're there so that they can be told that, with those directing those authorities, but that marine casualty investigation is happening separately. And so it's interesting because we learned in Costco Busan just how bad we were at messaging a lot of those things that were happening. Very few people know just how well that pollution response case went. When we talk about textbook definition of pollution response, it was what we often refer to as a textbook case for pollution response, but we just had a very bad media response. And in many companies and organizations have that where they do exactly what their operations manual says to do, but they lose control of the public. And, Stephen made an off the wall joke about tweeting and Xing. And that's a good example, right? Of losing your public messaging is because nobody knows what to call tweeting now. And, this is a company that prides themselves on communication. It's a perfect example. Like, I don't know what to call Xing. Like, what do I do? I'm like, am I still tweeting? What am I doing right now when I'm on my phone? And then, so that's a good example of exactly what we're talking about. One last question to wrap us up and we'll close out. You said something about trust, which I think is so pertinent. And the Coast Guard's we've been talking about some major successes for the Coast Guard. So let's take on a tough issue for the Coast Guard to close us out and talk about why we love the Coast Guard and we still have faith in the Coast Guard. But we'll take a little bit of a tougher issue as we do so, because trust is super important. And right now the Coast Guard is lacking some trust, and rightfully so. We acknowledge that. If you don't know why, we're going to talk a little bit about that, because trust is super important. And when you lose trust, that's a big deal. When you lose credibility, it's hard to get back. When you do those things in any capacity, it's really difficult. When you lose trust or credibility because of abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment, that's really tough to get back. So there's no doubt about it that we in the Coast Guard are facing an uphill battle, and a lot of it because of our own making. But I still believe in the Coast Guard. I'll let Stephen talk for himself about how he feels. I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I heard this comment at a National Naval Officers Association meeting, which really pushed me back, and I'm going to use that as my key. And so the Fouled Anchors article, which if you haven't read it, there's been a lot of press in CNN. You can probably look it up. There's some after action, but it talks about the Coast Guard and how the Coast Guard's covered up some sexual assault cases and sexual harassment cases. And it doesn't paint the Coast Guard in a positive light, rightfully so. It's really bad. We had the leadership, the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard were there at this conference. And one of these junior officers asked the MCPOG, was what we call the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and the Vice Commandant. He said, I just have been reading the Fouled Anchor report. I've been talking to some of our people that deal with sexual assault cases, and I couldn't in good conscience recommend my daughter to join the Coast Guard. Now that statement that was a penetrating statement to me that just really gave me pause. I was familiar with the Fouled Anchor report, and it was really troubling to me as well. But that statement itself really gave a different perspective that was powerful. And I ask you this question, Stephen, what's your response to that statement, and why would you still recommend the Coast Guard as a service of choice?
Absolutely. Some of the most phenomenal people I've met in terms of character, leadership, willingness to sacrifice have been the people that I've encountered in the Coast Guard. Also, some of the most difficult and some of the most challenging people I've met have been people I've encountered in the Coast Guard. And the reason why I am willing to continue to say and encourage anybody who is thinking about a career serving the public, serving the nation from a national security perspective to a safety of life at sea perspective to just an environmental stewardship perspective, a career in the Coast Guard is because we are committed to getting better. But because we are, as the Commandant is showing, willing to confront and acknowledge failures and say we are going to improve from it. Holding ourselves accountable is incredibly important, and learning and continuing to develop and continuing to emphasize the importance of our culture and developing a kind of culture in which people can be authentic and also be challenged to grow beyond themselves is incredibly important to the health of an organization. And I believe that we have the leadership, the right leadership, to take steps in that direction. And I say this because from a number of perspectives. One, I've been in the Coast Guard for my entire professional life, 20 plus years now. And I will say that at least from the perspective of a military justice practitioner, having prosecuted sex assault cases, having investigated sexual harassment and these types of cases, oftentimes success isn't spoken of very broadly and publicly. And there's consequences of that to that. And so, yes, there have clearly and obviously been cultural failures in the Coast Guard, and we have to confront that straight on. But there are also dedicated professionals that I've served with that have demonstrated all up and down the chain that they will not tolerate the kind of sexual assault, sexual harassment type of behavior. And, I'll say this, as a prosecutor, I've had the opportunity and I was assigned to prosecute a case which took over 2 years to bring to court for a number of different reasons. And in this case, the victim was a minor and also a member of a Native American tribe. And throughout the course of the case, what success looked like to me was, one, that we move forward and make sure that the member was afforded all of the protections under the Constitution and that the government was required to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And we did that in exhausting fashion, and to ultimately come to the just conclusion of the case in which what I received from the victim and the tribe was a sincerely heartfelt thank you for reestablishing their trust that the Coast Guard, that the government is holding the people accountable for what they did in the manner in which they did it. And now that doesn't happen in every single case because facts are different in every single case, but the Coast Guard does get it right. And I've seen that firsthand. And you might not necessarily see that necessarily on a CNN article, but having a token of thanks from the tribal members and from those who were involved in the case and seeing the consequence in that individual's life and how they turned back with gratitude and how it impacted the relationship between the Coast Guard and the tribe in that particular case, I think was particularly satisfying for me. And so I don't think that we necessarily need to trumpet our successes, but I would say that there are people whose leadership is defined by character and integrity. And I think that continues to this day. And where we have fallen short, I believe that in our organizational DNA, we have a willingness to embrace those as opportunities for improvement.
Oh, so wonderfully said. And yes, I agree. We cannot minimize the mistakes. We have to own it, be accountable, move forward with a desire to do better, to earn that trust in the same way that we reestablish that trust with that tribe, and do the work that's needed to do it every step of the way, because we need the public's trust to do the mission. We need the trust of each and every member to do the mission, to build the teams. We have to have an environment of psychological safety and pure trust. And we can't have that if we continue to have leaders that aren't going to foster that environment. And so we have to do better. And I do appreciate the Commandant's direction, the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, Heath Jones. I've worked with him. I know his character. I know that we're on the right course, and I appreciate your words there. Any final thoughts to wrap us up today, Stephen?
Keith, I've talked so much. I just wanted to say thank you for doing this. I know that this is your passion project, and I can attest, having listened to your other podcasts, you have such an incredible way of getting people to open up, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation.
Oh, I loved it. I could have talked to you for hours. I have before, and I will continue to do so. And we went for 2 episodes because we could have gone for probably 10 or 20. So the invite's open to have you back on again because we still have many other topics to talk about. And thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you've been edified. I hope you've enjoyed these leadership lessons that Stephen shared with us. I hope that your trust is beginning to grow with the Coast Guard again if it's been damaged. And I hope that you will come with us and help us reestablish it every step of the way and continue to be edified again. And have a wonderful day.